Welcome back to another episode of Travis, Can I Freaking Have This? Where we give you a CPA's perspective on questions you have about your dental practice. And if there's anything you should know about CPAs, the answer is probably going to be no. I'm just playing. But today we're going to talk about a question that I get a lot. And it's my clients, dental practice owners, asking, hey, can I buy this laser? Can I buy this dental chair? Can I get this cone beam? Again, who am I to tell you what you can and can't have? But a lot of times these questions involve purchasing something using debt. And so we're going to get into the question of debt and how much debt will really weigh you down in an unhealthy manner. As a practice owner, you have to learn to live with debt. Now, whether you started a practice from scratch or you bought an existing practice, you had debt involved. Now, before you even got to this point of buying or starting a practice, you had to go to dental school. And so you had to come to terms with taking on massive amounts of debt relative to the rest of the general population in the United States. And as a dentist, you need to have a healthy relationship with debt. I remember a post from Howard Ferran from Dental Town several years ago where he was kind of ranting about all these young dental kids who were complaining about all the debt that they have and talking about debt from dental school, and then they want to buy a house, and then they want to buy a practice, and then they have all these different things. They want to have a lifestyle, all these different things that require so much debt. And he had an interesting perspective. It's actually a blessing to have such easy access to this debt because the debt can empower you to do very good things as long as you maintain a healthy relationship with that debt. And so I want to try to talk about that topic today. What is a healthy amount of debt to have in your practice? And how can you frame your mind around adding more debt to your practice? What's a good amount? What's a bad amount? And let's break that down. We're going to focus on two primary pillars when it comes to looking at debt. We're going to look at it on a monthly basis, your monthly debt to income ratio. And then we're going to look at it just from a global perspective of your entire business, of your practice, and how much debt is too much debt. We're going to reference the debt to revenue ratio when we talk about that. But let's get into it. Can your practice afford more debt? This is a guide to help you be a smart borrower when it comes to debt. Let's go. All right, the first pillar we're going to talk about is what I'm referring to as a debt to income ratio. Now, this is going to sound very similar to the second pillar that we're going to talk about, which is we're calling the debt to revenue ratio. But debt to income ratio, really think of this first one as a monthly cash flow analysis of your debt. We're going to look at your monthly revenue and compare it to your monthly debt payments. And the ratio is simply that: monthly debt payments divided by your total monthly revenue. And that gets us a debt to income ratio in your practice. And this is a very good place to start when you think of the questions, can you afford to take on more debt? Another way to think about this is, can your personal lifestyle afford to take on more debt for the practice? Because effectively, this debt that is going to be required to be paid every month is money that would have otherwise gone home to you as the practice owner. And instead of taking it home, you're instead leaving it in the practice to pay debt. Now, one important thing, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a second, but I'm focusing in terms of this episode solely on your practice debt. A lot of banks, when they look at financing, they'll also grab in your personal debt. So think of your student loans or your mortgage, your home mortgage. Those things are not included on your practice financial statements. And so there are some elements to this debt to income ratio that are not going to be captured if we just look at the practice. But for somebody who's trying to make good, smart business decisions, a lot of times those student loans or mortgage, those aren't automatically populated in your practice financial statements. And so it's hard to use those on a monthly recurring basis. But just looking at your practice income and your practice debt, there is enough information there to be able to make smart decisions about how much debt you should add to your practice. And I'm going to give you some ranges right now. So again, this ratio that we're talking about is total monthly debt divided by your total monthly revenue. And the result that you get will tell you what range you're in of healthiness or unhealthiness based on the ratio that you get. So let's start out. If your ratio is less than 5%, you have what we're calling a mature and healthy practice. Now, you can see that we're not saying it's zero. There's kind of always this assumption that you will need to be reinvesting in the business. And that is expected, and you need to do that. A dental chair will not last 100 years, right? You need to buy new dental chairs. You need to invest in new things in the practice. And it's okay to have some level of debt. And that's somewhat expected, even for a mature practice owner. Now, that doesn't always happen. There's a lot of people that have zero debt, and then they get to the point when they need stuff, they just pay cash with it, right? And that's great. But just know that 5% or less is what we're calling a mature, healthy practice. We wouldn't change anything about that for the most part. The next range is between 6 and 10%. So if your ratio is between 6 and 10%, we're putting you also in a healthy category, but we are categorizing you as a young practice owner or early stage practice owner. Now, early stage these days could be anywhere less than 10 years, maybe 15 years, or coming up on 15 years. Anywhere under that, you're in this category where 6 to 10% of your income going to debt is somewhat to be expected. You did a startup, you purchased a practice, you had to take on a decent amount of debt, and you're going to carry that for a while. Eventually, that's going to go down over time. But to have 6 to 10% of debt to income ratio is not crazy, and it's to be expected in some scenarios. The next bucket we're going to get to is if your ratio is between 11% and 15%. This is an interesting category, and I've actually struggled on what to call this category in this bucket because I have a decent amount of clients in this bucket. And how I'm categorizing this bucket is it's okay, but it needs to go down. So if your debt to income ratio is between 11 to 15%, sometimes that happens. Like you have a practice, you had to make some improvements, you had to take more debt on than really is ideal, but it's okay. It's not going to totally strangle your business, but you definitely don't want to, if you're in this level, you don't want to add any more debt unless it's absolutely essential, necessary, and you are absolutely certain it's going to bring in more revenue for the business. But this category, I wouldn't be too stressed about it if I was in this bucket, but I also wouldn't be looking to add any more debt anytime soon. Then the next bucket we're going to call is 16% to 20%. If you're in this category, you're definitely in a pushing the limits of where you should be with debt. You're in a risky territory, and you need to have a plan on what you're going to do. I guess I don't know if I'd say a high risk, but you're starting to be in a low risk situation, and you need to make sure you're very strategic about your debt. So in that 11-15% range, it's okay, and you want to see things go down. Over 15%, you're in the 16 to 20% range. You really need to have a plan, and you need to know what you're going to be doing about your debt. Any ratio over 20%, there is a high probability that there is a high strain on your business because of the debt. Now, this, when I say 20%, if we think about a typical GP practice whose overhead, let's just say it's 70%. If a typical GP practice that you have has an overhead of 70%, and then there's 20% going to debt, that leaves the owner with 10%. And I haven't even taken into account student loans or food for your table at home after work, right? There's some other serious expenses in there. So you can start to see if we're at the 20% mark for debt to income ratio in your practice, things are really constrained. And that's why I say when you're in the really above 10%, you're starting to feel that constraint on your cash that you can take out of the business. And you really want to be careful when you're in that range. All right, now again, we talked about banks and how they're going to look at more of how much money you make on a monthly basis, your net income on a monthly basis, and then they're going to look at all of your personal debt, car loans, things like that. One thing I'll just say with this is you need to have a general sense on your personal lifestyle, what your personal debt is and what kind of lifestyle you live, because that will impact some of these ranges that we just talked about. You could need a certain amount of cash out of the business, and your debt to income ratio could be 5%, which I just said was a healthy amount. But that might be too much for you because you have too many personal things you need to take care of. And that's pushing the limits on just your global cash flow. But just looking at the practice financials in isolation, that is a range from 5 to 20%. To keep in mind, you want it to be closer to 5%, for sure under 10%. And then if you're over that 10% range, just know you're going to start to feel a constraint on your practice debt and income and just cash flow in general. Now, this is not a perfect formula, but this is a general tool to give you an idea on where you're at on a monthly basis. Now let's jump to the second pillar. The second pillar we're calling debt to revenue ratio, but really this is a very zoomed out look at your practice. And we're going to say, is your practice over leveraged? Do you have too much debt? Can you take on more debt? And this one's a hard one to answer from a scientific standpoint, but it is an important one. So just know over time, you hope to build equity in your practice. And at some point, you're going to sell your practice, and that equity you're going to take out. Now, the more debt you have, that effectively reduces your equity. So you want to get your debt down over time because that will build more equity in your practice. Now, it takes debt effectively to build the equity. So it's okay to have debt. But when we think about the long-term outlook on your practice, you don't want to have a very high amount of debt in your practice over the long term. So let's look at this debt to revenue ratio. Now, the formula on this is very similar, but we're looking at it on an annual basis. So we're looking at your total debt at any given point divided by your annual revenue. Think about it as like your most recent 12 months of revenue. Total debt divided by a 12 months of revenue gives you what we're calling a debt to revenue ratio. In your debt to revenue ratio, the range that we're going to have here. And now think about this before I get into these ranges. A lot of people, when they're buying a general GP practice, a lot of people talk about this 80% of revenue ratio. If I'm buying a GP practice and it collects $1 million a year, I should expect to pay $800,000 for that practice. Now, that's not always the case, but that's the most common metric that I hear thrown out when people talk about buying a practice, 80% of revenue. Now, if that is the case, and if it's not always the case, but it's not a bad place to start mentally. If that is the case, that means you're going to get an $800,000 loan to buy a $1 million practice. That effectively is an 80% debt to revenue ratio. 80% of the annual revenue is the total debt to buy that practice. So let's go through some ranges. The first range we're going to say is under 20% is a mature, healthy practice. So again, going back to $1 million in annual revenue, if you have $200,000 or less of debt, that's to be expected. That's ongoing things and improvements and stuff that you just kind of need for a mature practice. But really, you don't see it go above 20%. It's usually honestly lower than that, much lower than that. But less than 20% is a mature, healthy practice. Between 21 and 60%, we're calling a healthy, sustainable practice, but has signs of being a younger practice or a newer practice owner. And again, this is to be expected if we go back to that. You purchased a practice or you started a practice from scratch, you had a very high debt to revenue ratio, and that's starting to go down, but it takes a while for that to go down. So this 21 to 60% ratio range is still healthy. You're not overly leveraged, but it's starting to go down over time. The next range is anyone that's in the 61% to 90% range. This is a range we see happen often, especially if you're buying a practice and you feel like you're overpaying for it, which is okay in the short term, but you need to start seeing that go down. If you're in the 61 to 90% range on your debt to revenue, you should be expecting your debt to go down and not adding any more debt. Again, unless it's absolutely essential. The last category is anyone that has over 90% debt to revenue ratio. You're in a high risk territory. You're starting to be in this territory where if you sold your practice, you would potentially owe money. You don't have enough equity in your practice to walk away with anything, right? So you don't want to be in that territory. You don't want to have negative equity in the business. And so a 90% or more debt to revenue ratio is what we're calling the danger zone. And you need to have a plan on what you're going to do about that. Now, the worst horror stories I've experienced in the world of dental practice ownership are people that buy a big practice, and it's usually, a good practice and has a decent amount of goodwill. And so they immediately start with an 80 to 90% debt to revenue ratio, which again, we're saying is okay in the short term, as long as that's going down quickly. But soon after buying the practice, we're talking within 1 to 3 years of buying that practice, they cannot stand the smell of the office, the look of the office, the whole vibe, right? It's thrown off their feng shui. And so they want to do a renovation, or they want to get all new computers, get some cone beams, just modernize this office. They just paid a bunch of money for a practice, and then they're going to add $300,000 to $400,000 of new debt to the practice. And that new debt is not going to bring new revenue. Let's just assume they're not adding operatories, anything like that. They're just doing a refresh on the office. Those people immediately now have over 100% debt to revenue ratio. And we see this eventually strangle those practice owners. And they not only are strangled on a monthly cash flow basis, but now they can't even walk away from the practice with positive equity. They can't walk away from the practice without owing additional money to the bank. Now, it's surprising sometimes that banks lend on this, but they do. And there are dental practice owners that are in this situation, and I definitely do not recommend it. So you want to be very aware of where you're at on these two ratios on a monthly basis and on a global basis. And if you're in one of these danger zones, just know debt should be avoided. If you're not in one of these danger zones and you have an opportunity to add something to your practice, it will add debt, but it's in a healthy range, and you think it will improve the office in some way, there's absolutely an opportunity and a green light for you to do that. So let's go through a couple examples and talk about how I would approach these. So the first one is just talk to a client who wants to add an operatory to their dental practice. And they have the square footage, they have the space, they just need to build it out, equip it with a dental chair, delivery system, all that stuff. And they, for my illustration purposes, let's just say it's $100,000 to do this. It was actually more than that, but $100,000 to build out an additional operatory. They're going to finance that $100,000 over 5 years, which is going to be about $2,000 a month in debt payments. They believe this new operatory will bring an additional $15,000 of revenue. And this is, we're trying to actually be kind of conservative with this and just say it's just going to be used for hygiene, right? It could be even more if you're adding an associate dentist in there, but $15,000 a month in revenue, $2,000 a month in cost. That increases your debt to income ratio, the monthly one, by 1.3%. And you can see that's a pretty small amount, meaning you're probably going to get a green light from everyone under the sun if you're in this scenario. If you're going to add an operatory, yes, it brings in debt, but it brings in long-term revenue. That's a great thing. Absolutely go forward with that. That is good debt. The second example is probably the more common one we get, and this is adding equipment to the office. This time we're going to talk about a cone beam. We're going to purchase a cone beam for $120,000. And believe it or not, Patterson is going to give us these super easy financing terms. All we got to do is pay $2,200 a month. I have no idea how much interest it is, but I'm just paying $2,200 a month. They make it super easy, right? I should just do it. Well, let's look at your ratios and see where that comes out to be. And in this example, the cone beam usually does not generate additional revenue. Now, every cone beam rep in the world, who I'm sure are great people, are trained to tell you that it will add more revenue if you do certain billing procedures and you bill for it and different things like that. In theory, maybe it adds a little bit of revenue, but honestly, probably not a significant amount of revenue, not like adding a new operatory. Now, it absolutely is a good thing long-term for the value of your practice. And, clinically, I can't speak to that. I know a lot of people swear clinically they need a cone beam to be able to do treatment correctly, and it's hard to argue with that. But if I'm just looking at it from a debt perspective, hey, I have $2,200 now in a debt payment. I need to compare that to my current revenue and my current debt and how that's going to change my ratio. Because depends on how much revenue I'm doing. I don't have a specific number on this example, but just know because it's not bringing in more revenue, it's potentially going to be a lot more difficult to justify that. So this has a yellow light. It depends on where you're currently at, and it depends on how much of this is a need versus a want. Can you wait a little longer until some of your other debt is paid down? Just know with all of this that there is no magic number, but there are definite red flags that you want to be aware of. I don't hear people talking a lot about how much debt is too much debt. What ratio should they be looking at? I honestly don't know. I haven't really talked to very many other even dental CPAs that use specific ratios. I hope though that this is a good starting point. We'll post this on our website, on our blog, so you can kind of see these metrics and how to calculate them and how to identify your own metrics. If you're thinking about adding some debt, you can do a quick calculation and see where you're at on this chart to know if you're in the danger zone, and probably don't even mess with it. If you're not in the danger zone, make sure you still have a good use case on what you're going to do with that debt. But again, debt is not evil. Just make sure you're measuring it. Make sure it doesn't choke the growth of your practice. Stay aware, stay proactive, and don't be impulsive when you're buying things. Thanks so much. Check out the links in the podcast episode for more information on some of these charts that we talked about, and hope to see you next time. Thanks so much.